and welcome all. It is my pleasure to welcome all the eminent panelists here today at APAC Higher EdTech Innovation Conclave on the day 3rd. Today, we have a very important panel discussion, which is funding and financing of education institutions and the role of government in this. For this, we have eminent panelists with us, starting with Professor K. Rama Mohan Rao, Vice Chairman, AP State Council of Higher Education. Thank you so much, Professor K. Rama Mohan Rao, for joining us today. We have with us Professor Prem Vrat, Chairman, Board of Governance, IIT Dhanbad and IIT Mandi, Pro-Chancellor, Professor of Eminence and Chief Mentor, the NorthCap University. Thank you so much, Professor Prem Vrat, for joining us today. We have with us Dr. Shrihari, Prakash, Honwad, President, Sir Padampat Singhania University, and who would also be moderating that session. Thank you so much, Dr. Shrihari, for joining us for this session. We have with us Harsh Shah, CEO, India affiliate of the Institute of Risk Management. Thank you so much, Mr. Harsh, for joining us for this very important session. Now, I would like to request Dr. Shrihari for moderating this session. Please, over to you, Dr. Shrihari.
Thank you, Mr. Arora. I think it's my privilege to be amongst such wonderful people. I'm sure we will take this discussion to a great conclusion. This discussion has been happening for quite some time, ever since the privatization of education started. Initially, the privatization used to happen because of philanthropy, and the infrastructure would be created and then the government would support these institutions. But as the population increased and the need increased, obviously the government kitty was under strain to support many institutions, and it opened the doors for private institutions to come into play. And while it started in Karnataka, I'm sure Andhra followed very closely later, and today all over the country we have private institutions and private universities, universities which are state universities and deemed universities, and of course we do have the public universities, which are again state and central universities. There is also an analysis which we keep talking about, how much money is spent in public universities, and which runs into several lakhs of rupees per IIT graduate. For example, I'm sure there are year on year there are reports of how many lakhs of rupees are going behind each creation of each graduate, IIT graduate. And when you compare that with the costliest of private university, it looks as if these graduates are being created cheaper, although for the end user these are costly, elite, and the universities are also looked at as profit making, which is not the topic. But nevertheless, if these institutions have to come up to the level which the government would like them to, which the nation would like them to, let me say, that we should be competent, we should be competing with the world universities, we should have universities in the world rankings. And that can happen if not only our public universities perform well, but most of the private universities, which in some form are feeders to the public universities. For example, IITs, if you look at the EdTech program, is totally fed from the private institutions, and therefore it's necessary that the culture across all universities, the quality across all universities, and the environment across all universities is similar and conducive to making a quality product. With that in mind, I think the first thing we would talk about is, should government fund private universities. Public universities, it's already funding. Should government fund private universities? And since we have Professor Prem from IIT Dhanbad, I would request Professor Prem to spend a couple of minutes and give us the benefit of his vision and argument. Professor Prem please. You are muted, sir. You have to unmute yourselves.
Okay. Am I okay? Thank you,
Yeah,
Dr. Shrihari. Well, I believe that since your focus in opening remark is more on private versus government, I think we need to take the debate to a higher level. The funding in general to education itself is weak in India.
that's right.
Example, you find that even under the new education policy, it says it will endeavor in next 10 years to take it to 6% of the GDP. Whereas right now, the present expenditure on education, in all forms of education, as a part of GDP is only 3%. Now,
Yes.
6% has been promised right in all the previous new education policies, including in 68, the Kothari Commission, then in 86, and even now the present policy. And therefore, in general, while most of the developed countries, like if we look at, for example, Sweden, Norway, they spend about 7 to 8% of their GDP on education. And therefore, in general, we need to increase, almost double this funding, because after all, if the money available itself is so low, you can only spread it very thin across government and private, and it will not make an impact. So therefore, first and foremost, we need to impress upon that the effectiveness of this policy of education would be very realizable in case we are able to increase the funding, which of course it does talk about, but it doesn't guarantee, it doesn't ensure 6% of the GDP on this, because I believe for excellence, you require 4 parameters: faculty, funding, freedom, and flexibility.
Wonderful.
And that's it. Funding is an extremely important, and the rest of it will be derived. You can't attract
We'll
the best.
take care. Will come automatically. Will come automatically.
Will come.
Sir, can I come back to you if you don't mind? I would like to take Professor Rama on the same issue.
Yeah.
Professor Rama, a couple of minutes, please, because we will want to take into account everybody else's this thing also. You will have to mute yourself, Professor Rama.
Thank you, Dr. Shrihari Garu. I do agree with whatever Professor Prem mentioned it. Yes, the funding that is being given right now is inadequate. And when we are talking about the public institutions and private institutions, leave about the private universities, the entire higher education or in school education, almost 80% of this education is now in the hands of private sector. And the government funding is going for the public sector as well as private sector in different ways. One is direct support, and the other is support to the students. So many governments are adopting fee reimbursement programs, fellowship programs, scholarship programs, and so much money is being spent on the students, and in turn going to the institutions. But the issue is the private institutions' motive in running the institutions. Though all the private institutions are required to register themselves as societies with charitable motives, but we all know what is happening in reality. So commercial motives are dominating, and the public money that is invested, you have rightly pointed out, huge money per unit is being invested by the government for the public good, but somehow it is not getting realized. The accountability is missing, and then we entered into the private university concept. Fortunately, in India, 80% of the top-rated institutions are in the public sector. Only a few private universities or institutions could able to stand to the expected standards and remaining totally on commercial models. You said the research component. Very few private universities are focusing on research, and the majority are just teaching universities and trying to make money, whatever that they can make it out. And all the programs they are offering, they are self-financed and they are collecting money from the students. And even
can I interrupt you? I think you have made a very interesting point that the private players are not really accountable and could lead to they're unregulated in some sense. Whereas if you ask the private players, they'll say they are over-regulated and hence they can't just move around, and it's not a level playing ground. And your idea that government should reimburse the fees of the students, and that's the best way of ensuring fund flow to this thing. I think it's a very interesting take, sir. Let me now get Mr. Harsha on this issue of funding public and private institutions. Professor Prem Vrat had already identified that the GDP, which is the larger problem which need to be solved. Once that is solved, some of these other problems which are cropping up because of the strain on the budget may disappear. But I want your take on this issue, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Honwad, and very good afternoon to all the fellow panelists and the audience. See, if you study the entire education system and link it to a private business model, there's always a challenge of this return on investment. Even universities providing the best quality education across the world, they are technically incurring a $1.5 in expenses for every $1 that they collect as student fees. So this large deficit is often made up by contributions from endowments or philanthropic contributions from alumni, well-wishers. And beyond these operational deficits, universities and education institutions also need to find ways to fund their capital expenditure and maintain the large campuses. If I go by the traditional corporate finance concepts of equity and debt, of course, by virtue of the structure of the colleges and universities in India, they operate as a society or a not-for-profit company or a trust where the funds are supposed to be parked, and then there are certain regulations which prohibit any kind of private funding. On the debt side, most of these education institutions are highly leveraged because they have already provided their assets, their, I would say, the campus, the infrastructure, land, whatever is owned by them, by virtue of securing more funds from banks and financial institutions. Now, if you don't have any add-on security to raise further capital on the debt side, and then on the equity side, there are constraints from a legal structure point of view because of the trust and society, how do you expect education institutions to then survive? In the Western countries, we have seen classic models of interest income and investment returns by way of endowment fund investments. But in India, we are not yet there in terms of a culture. Rarely do we see alumni students contributing large sums of 50 crore and 100 crore to their alma mater. So till we reach that stage culturally, and the regulators realize that we can do away with this trust and society structure and also open up doors to some kind of unsecured structured finance, I don't think universities will have a very clear business continuity plan in the way forward.
Can I interrupt? Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point you have made, Mr. Harsh. You need to have some way of supporting yourselves, which means you look at who are your clients, and the clients should support the product. Who are your customers, and the customers should support the product. For higher education, it's the industry or the larger society which is your customer, and the larger society should support the production cost by way of either through the taxes which the government spends on you, or through the industry innovation funds which the industry invests in higher education institutions, and the philanthropic inputs from the society, whether you call it alumni or you call it big industrialists who have made money and who would like to invest in these things. Having said that, I have a question for Professor Rama Rao. It's very easy to denigrate the private these things because of a few private operators, cutting corners and not doing it the right thing. But all said and done, there is also debatable this thing that the private institutes are much better organized. They're much more efficient in terms of financial handlings. So where is it that we are what is it that is missing between government viewing of the private this thing?
Yeah, see, the private universities, whatever, they have a lot of freedom in fixation of the fees to the different courses and generating resources through different sources. But as far as governmental institutions are concerned, we are restricting them to confined to only financial support from the government. We are conditioning them that you have to charge only this much fees, not more than that, which is very, very low. Say, for example, in Andhra Pradesh, the government say offers an MBA seat for 10,000 rupees and an MA seat for 3,000 rupees. So that is the fee structure, and also that money is reimbursed.
But that's subsidized, which means the government takes it upon itself.
Yeah.
So you for somebody from private sector, it looks like you have a blank check from the government. I'm sure it's not as blank as it seems. So this is a wonderful input from you, sir. I will now move to Professor Prem, because sir, you started talking about the new education policy. Can you help us understand, what is it that new that is expected, and what kind of things it will push on the private sector, private institutions also?
The new education policy definitely improves the scenario that private institutions were being looked at earlier. If you look at the new education policy, it makes it almost very categorical statement that the difference between a private and government-funded government-owned institutions must not be focused. So it says that all institutions must be seen on the basis of their performance, quality, equity, and excellence, irrespective of the form of ownership. That, to my mind, is a very major stand that this policy takes. Secondly, in order to support this assertion, they have created what is called NRF, National Research Foundation, with an initial endowment of 50,000 crores. And in this National Research Foundation, any institution, whether government or private, is eligible to send a proposal. Is the quality of the research proposal that will be the criterion for funding, and not the source of ownership, whether it's from government or private, which used to happen earlier. And to my mind, therefore, it's a major relief to the private institutions in the new education policy. Similarly, on the basis of your performance, suppose there is a funding available based on your graduate outcomes. If you are within the top 100 and NIRF ranked institutions, then you almost have same degree of flexibility for seeking support from the government sources as any other government institution has. Therefore, to my mind, the new education policy makes a major departure in that process. Then, in addition to supporting research, it is coming out with, in fact, it already has Prime Minister Research Fellowship, where a person even and a top-ranking student to attract brilliant minds for research, which the private institutions are not able to have the money to fund research. Prime Minister Research Fellowship, the fellowship amount is 70,000 rupees a month, which even many institutions don't even pay to the faculty per month that way. And therefore, then there will be 500 postdoctoral research fellowships and funded doctoral fellowships, national fellowships every year, which would be available to people from anywhere on a competitive basis. So therefore, the new education policy definitely removes the clear distinction, because I very strongly believe that this form of ownership should never be the criterion of funding. It is the performance that should matter. But at the same time,
Fair.
I'd also like to say very clearly that I mean, I work in a private university as a Pro-Chancellor. I have been in IIT all through. I'm associated with IIT. The major point, in fact, if the private institutions can demonstrate a complete transparency of the funds flow, give them total freedom, but let that every rupee that is going into the institute from whichever sources must be accounted, where does it go? So the moment you ensure a complete fund transparency in the process and make it as auditable as anywhere, the moment you submit to the public audit of the money and have a total transparency where the money goes, I believe the distinction must vanish. But you cannot have lack of transparency where the money goes and yet expect the money to come from the government sources. To my mind, it's a disconnect. That's one point which I wanted to mention. Secondly, even in the government funding, because you see, we need to address this issue. Particularly, I thought that since the session has a composite name, funding and financing, they are not the same thing. Funding and financing needs to be seen differently. So while for financing education, the government can create a facilitating environment even for the private sector by kind of giving maybe collateral free guarantee for, but then it has to be returned back. Therefore, funding per se and financing need to be seen differently. And therefore, in my opinion, there's so much of opportunity available. And even, for example, to the IT system, you'll be surprised to know, Dr. Mohana particularly, that IIT, the fee for IIT BTech is 2 lakh rupees a year. It's not 30,000 or 15,000 or not 15 rupees that I paid in IIT Kharagpur when I was studying in 1962. Therefore, apart from the funding, the imbalance in funding to the education is another important issue. If you address about 80% of the money that meant for technical education, perhaps is being taken away by the so-called elite technical institutions, and whatever remaining is spread rather thin. So even state engineering colleges are really starving of money. Even state universities are starving of money, because not only the money, even their allocation, because two things are important in financial management: the quantum of money available and its fair allocation, and linking it with performance. That means the outcome, what's happening. And therefore, that's what we need to address. And secondly, even whatever money is available, what proportion of it goes to making real estate and what proportion of it goes for intellectual capital? To my mind, personally speaking, it is the faculty should be treated as an asset and the buildings as liability. In many private institutions, the buildings may be the asset and the faculty may be liability. That's a disconnect in my opinion. And therefore, while I'm all for getting the best attention to private institutions, because they're contributing the same purpose as the government institution, namely creating an outstanding human resource for the country. So there's no reason to differentiate, but let there be fair play even in terms of accountability, transparency, and the allocation of money. Because if you create most of the money goes in buildings, let's say, it does not create, because buildings may be necessary, but they are not sufficient for the purpose of excellence. So in my opinion, the issue must be addressed holistically.
Wonderfully put, sir. Can I now go back to Professor Mohan Rao to respond on this idea that let's stop looking at private and public, and let's not call them names. Is the government machinery ready to take that view?
Yeah, the vision of the NEP, as well as the desirable consequence that we are looking at, is that there should not be any difference on the ownership of the institute. Definitely, we should look at the performance of the institute, provided the right point Prem has mentioned, that the transparency in fund utilization, which is grossly missing, say in our country, in majority of the institutions, leave about a few institutions we don't know, but majority of them. But when we look at already, I told you the majority in the hands of the private sector. But one aspect that we have to keep in mind, the rural-urban divide. So, large number of private institutions are concentrating on urban areas, and they are expecting the student flow from rural to urban. And the government institutions, to a large extent, they are getting established in the rural segment, and they are trying to create accessibility to the people. So the performance variations definitely would be, say, obviously presenting between urban the established institutions and rural institutions where the facilities or resources are very, very limited. And one
Very,
important point,
yeah, go ahead.
one important point Prem Vrat rightly mentioned is the competencies of the faculty and treating faculty as an asset and giving adequate weightage to the faculty. So we could see two different things. On the public sector, the faculty are paid well and the performance is very low. And in the private sector, the faculty are not paid well, but they could able to extract some kind of performance. This is a dichotomy, which needs to be seriously addressed.
That's what I said when I said efficiencies, etc. Sir, any discussion these days would be incomplete if we don't talk of the pandemic, which we are still going through. Although we seem to fear it much lesser than what we did a year ago, almost to the day when the lockdown philosophy started. How does pandemic affect the edutech requirements of institutions, and what kinds of financing and funding are we looking at? I think we will take Mr. Harsha on this. You get the first say on the edutech transformation and the funding requirements for that.
Well, I think Professor Vrat and Professor Rama Mohan Roy have really given great insights. I truly believe that governance, self-sustenance, and at the same time, there should be no distinguished ideology between a private and a public kind of an institution. With regard to the edtech players, I think they've presented a great opportunity in this digital world where there's no reach. I mean, there's no boundary. You can get a student from Africa, you can get a student from China, you can get a student from Canada. And I think that's the advantage that Indian edtech players can really bring to the forefront. And in terms of funding, I'm sure you know that most of them are already backed by private equity funds or venture capitalists. So I don't see much of a need from a government intervention point of view, unless some of the fees which may get subsidized, where some of the students may be promoted to take up the courses online or take on these add-on qualifications, certifications, professional qualifications, because that's going to always be a parallel activity along with a formal degree. Look, we can't replace physical education. I always keep saying that. People may have different views about this, but you can't completely get rid of the physical form of education. This will always be a hybrid form. And even in a post-crisis world, you're going to see students who are desperately waiting back to come into the campus. So how do we really form that hybrid structure where, yes, certain students who are studying at a private institution or a public institution, however their mode of learning is governed, parallelly, can there be certain subsidies which can be given for studying online or taking up some of the online courses? So I think that's an important component. And also answering some of the points which Professor Vrat mentioned. With growing interest in India, and also we're seeing a huge fee increase in the West. So India is really being looked at as an aspirational destination by many Asian and African countries. So there's no reason why foreign students cannot become an add-on source of revenue. I think the government is already working on a study in India program. And I believe that there could be a great model for private and public education institutions. Maybe 10%, 15% of their top line or revenue can really be earmarked towards funds that can be received from foreign students. And then the last thing which I want to talk about is one of the innovative financing structures which we are seeing in certain developed countries is the fee discounting model, where what happens, and this goes in line with what Professor Vrat mentioned, that you need to have a self-sustaining institution, whether you are private or public. Now, if the students are given an opportunity to pay their fees over a period of 8 months, 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, that way your enrollments are going to go up. And this will specifically apply in this post-COVID world because liquidity is significantly impacted. We're seeing parents and students struggling to pay even a 20,000 fees or even a 10,000 fees in some pockets. And by virtue of that, they are all deciding whether should we take a drop year, should we pursue something completely online, do we really need to go to the campus because the campus is not open. Why should I pay for the laboratory fees? Why should I pay for testing fees and other add-on fees? So by virtue of that, if the university or the education institution is able to give them a deferral program and partner with an NBFC or a bank or a financial institution who can discount all these fees and pay to the education institution upfront, that kind of model will bring in significant cash flow for the higher education segment.
Yeah, this very much looks like the consumer, a product model which has worked well in the last couple of decades, where people buy a TV and pay through EMIs, something which they couldn't dream of. They even buy a house and pay through EMIs, I'm sure. But is that model really going to ease and then the financial institutions which are involved with it, what happens when they ill-treat the defaulters, and what about the I would say the virtue of this entire business of education, that you are bringing in so much of commercialism that you in turn are ill-treating your customer, uh, which is all right for a TV manufacturer, but can an academic institution live with that? I think these are some questions which will keep cropping up, and we will have to answer them. Uh, uh, but I think this is a very interesting financing model which will come into play, and a lot of people would take full advantage of it, because more often than not, it's the lump sum payment which is hurting people, and if it's spread over a certain period of time, which is making it a softer loan, a short-term loan, instead of the educational loan which banks give, which you can repay in next 5 years after graduation or something like that. But this is a very interesting model which has really come in post-pandemic. I understand, and the universities are even taking some of the universities, good universities, are even taking the burden of that small interest component, which is about 2 to 3% of the total fees charged onto themselves. It's worthwhile, ensuring that the fund flow situation remains intact. Uh, we have touched upon various aspects. I think it's time for us to make a consolidated statement. I believe my three of my co-panelists, I can give you each 7 minutes, 7 to 8 minutes, to make a summarized statement, and your one important advice for institutions, private or public, to make sure that you are self-sustainable. We'll start with Harsha, if everybody agrees. Professor Vrat, I want you to have the last word. So I'm going first Harsha, then Professor Rama Mohan Rao, and then Professor Vrat. Harsh, your take on the complete.
No, so I think the national education policy definitely lays down a framework for overall cooperation between public spending, private philanthropy, and even impact investing. And I think it's time we see the implementation of the policy to really evaluate whether private or public education institutions will be in a position to self-sustain create a stronger continuity plan for the future and ensure that there are sufficient cash flows and even clear fund management policies going forward.
Professor Mohan Rao,
Yeah.
you
See,
you have you have you have 7 to 8 minutes easily. So please
yeah.
elaborate.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
See, the first issue that I wanted to speak about the pandemic and its impact and the tech interventions during that. So, sitting at the apex body of a state, higher education, we have seen certain challenges in technology interventions all of a sudden. We wanted to make into the education system because of the pandemic. So private institutions could quickly respond to it, and they started offering online courses to the lectures to the students across. But when it comes to the public institutions, the teachers are good; they could able to make it out, but access became a big problem because many villages are not connected with the internet. If at all they are connected, but bandwidth is the problem. And so many students, particularly belonging to vulnerable sections of the society, they don't have smartphones. And this became a big issue. Some students could have the access of the system, and the majority could not have the access of the system. And now the government has come out with a very heavy hand, and they wanted to distribute the notebooks and laptops to the students, and thanks to the government, they have already allocated nearly 2,000 crores for it. But during the pandemic, we could not able to reach, or the institutions, public as well as majority of the private institutions, could not able to reach the people. Though they have the corporates, we have developed the content very well, and the course systems are available, but access became a big problem. So that is one thing which the finance need to be addressed into. But when we look at the overall education system and the kind of support that is to be extended by the government, one clarity is that definitely government has to play a significant role in supporting education, treating whatever kind of expenditure that is made on this sector is not an expenditure, but it is an investment on the society, on the development of the society. We are very clear that education improves the productivity of the people in whatever segment they are, whether they are working in public sector or private sector, within the country or outside the country. But the thing is that you could exploit the demographic dividend that we have in the country only when sufficient and right kind of support financially is extended to the institutions. The low level of performance of public sector institutions leave about the central institutions. Many majority of the state funded state institutions, universities and colleges, they are, because of the shortage of funds, the government is supporting only to meet the salary component of the institutions, but not anything else. So they don't have adequate infrastructure, they don't have the state-of-art laboratories, and they don't have adequate number of faculty also. Shortage of faculty is a serious problem, and almost if you look at the universities, only 40% of the regular positions are now with the people, and the remaining they are say being run with hired people by paying a very meager amounts to them. So this is seriously affecting the quality of the institutions. So now, apart from this management and governance and finance of the institutions, one important gap that we have to realize that the course structures or the programs that we are offering and the content that we are delivering is not matching to the needs of the industry. There is a huge gap existing, and we are unable to translate those gaps into the academic programs. So this gap, is the existing institutions and the resources that they are having are unable to address, and which need to be addressed by, according to my opinion, a national body closely monitoring the changes within the country and outside the country, and say designing the programs accordingly, and suggesting those
Very, very,
programs.
very, very correct, sir. You're making a wonderful point of quality, ensuring funding and finance situation. Since we are focused on funding, uh, let me interrupt you on funding. Let's also understand that with the online scenario coming in, the students are feeling like, as you rightly pointed out, why should we be paying for the laboratory? Why should we be paying for infrastructural fees? Is there a sense of, the cost of education which will come down by bringing in online? Another theory that's going around is that online seems to be one way of scaling up for India's needs. You can educate anybody in a at much lower cost. Is that something which the existing universities also need to bring it as part of their thing? Before I go to Professor Premvat, I just want both of you to respond in 2 sentences. Mr. Harsha,
That's the problem.
I think Mr. Harsha has some technical difficulties. Professor Mohan, you can respond on to that.
There is definitely a need to change the model of operation of the universities that are now presently following conventional models. As Raj said, we have to change the system. We have to allow the technology to intervene into the system and make things accessible to all the people. And one important factor is we should train the students how to learn themselves. Self-learning mechanisms, which are right now is not present in vast majority of the institutions. Still, we are following the conventional, what we call spoon feeding methods, and that the technology intervention definitely makes it. We should welcome that kind of move, and we should change the governance models of the higher education.
Point well taken, sir. While we can wait for Mr. Harsh to join back in, I must move over to Professor Premvat. Sir, give me a consolidated this thing. I'm giving you 10 complete minutes overview of various issues we have discussed and your
Yes.
take on these issues.
Okay. Actually, I'll address the issue funding and financing separately. So that's the theme of the
Yes.
session. Now, on the funding front, as I mentioned already, there is a great need on the part of the government and the society to look at education not as an expenditure, but as an investment in nation building. Because, that means what we need to do is to change the mindset towards education, both the government and the society. It's an investment in nation building, because if we don't do so, the opportunity cost of not doing so can be far more enormous. And what demographic dividend that Professor Mohan mentioned might become a demographic disaster when they are not employable. We therefore need to. Number two, in terms of funding, as I already mentioned, that while the government would fund the direct funding and budgeting to the government-owned institutions, understandably, but an indirect funding by the government to private sector should be encouraged, and this is already happening. And the new education policy talks about, for example, through the funding through scholarships, through fellowships, PhD fellowships, MTech fellowships, scholarships, supporting the conferences for the faculty and students, travel grants for international conferences. These are the forms of funding which the government can give both to private as well as government liberally on the basis of the quality of the proposal submitted, and it's already happening. There could be special grant given to facilitate, for example, in hostels for weaker students, or in rural areas, or for disadvantaged categories, where perhaps, so those are the kinds of support that government should give both through private as well as government institutions. But in addition to giving money, particularly from the government, the timely dispersal of the grant is as important as the grant per se. So if the grant does not come till the last month of the financial year, and suddenly the rest of the grant comes at that time, I'm
That is
afraid its proper utilization may be jeopardized, and it may be money wasted and not put to great use. Therefore, not only the money, but the timely dispersal and accountability and transparency in using it for the purpose intended are important dimensions. And to that extent, now what is important for the government to provide a policy support for funding to the private institutions. Now, therefore, not many of you may be knowing that if I donate 100 rupees to IIT system, I get 100% tax rebate. But if I give that 100 rupees to a private university, I only get 50% tax rebate. Therefore, at least this can be a level playing field. And if at all there has to be a distinction, it should be in favor of private funding. So when you give 100% tax rebate to a government institution, so if I give donation to a government institution, right now only IITs get that 100% tax rebate. Even the rest of the government institution get 50%. So let me put it on the same pedestal: 100% tax rebate to all government institutions, both state and center, and maybe to encourage a liberal funding by the society to private, a greater degree of give 125% tax rebate to private institutions, so that there is a built-in tax incentive. So if at least if I'm giving 100 rupees, I get a small little, it's a notional tax relief. So this is what I believe, that this is a policy intervention through which huge amount of money can be funded even to the private sector, which right now they are put at percentage, and I see no reason why it can't be given. That's one thing. Secondly, about financing, the weak students, there is a very powerful model of financing the fee structure of the student, and this model is very successfully working in Australia. What they do, anybody who has got admission to an engineering college or so automatically gets the loan without any collateral guarantee being given. The state gives that, and the person would be only liable to pay it only after getting the job, and it directly gets collected. In fact, there is a tax mechanism where, when the salary is paid, part of the percentage of the salary is automatically deducted for the payment of loans. If that happens, the financing of education will become almost very comfortable to everyone, rich or poor. And I see no reason why we can't do that kind of. Thirdly, even the CSR money, which indeed is a very powerful, gold mine to the private sector for educational funding, has not been fully tapped for the purpose intended. So we can perhaps, and this can only happen if we develop a sense of respect with the industry, so that they know that we are doing useful, relevant work. So a greater degree of involvement of industry can even help in getting financing or funding through CSR money, which is mandatory to every profit-making institution. And if that happens, there perhaps will be huge amount of money made available to even the private sector institution, because we have not fully explored CSR funding. And finally, society must also change its mindset towards education. To me, education is a very sacred temple of nation building. So as liberals, they give money and donations to temples, why should they not treat these educational institutions as temples and liberally, wholeheartedly give money for the cause of nation building? Because such a temple, such as the educational institution, are far more powerful in the process of nation building. So the change of the society mindset, the moment they treat an education institution as good as a temple, perhaps they'll be more liberal and large-hearted in giving donations, because then it's for the purpose intended. But I still believe there has to be 100% transparency and accountability if the money is received. Because my worry is that unless we're sure on that, people will not have a greater degree of confidence in liberally funding to a private sector, because they must know where the money is going, and much of it must go for intellectual capital such as faculty and academic resources, and not for building real estate buildings. That's the way that I look at things. And I believe if that happens, perhaps the education in itself, and then finally create an environment, maybe through funding, through financing, through respect, where the best and the brightest of the society joins teaching and research as first love. If that happens, and that requires funding and flexibility and freedom. and therefore create an environment through liberal funding, both private and government, so that the best and the brightest of the society would join teaching and research of love. And if that happens, the rest would follow. Thank you.
Professor Ramohan Rao, you want to add something? We have really heard a wonderful thing. If I try to summarize, I will be literally, not only testing my memory, but also trying to reproduce what Professor Rath has indicated. Looks like we have lost Mr. Harsh. He must be having some trouble coming back in. But before he comes back in, Professor Ramarao, you can use a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I fully endorse Professor Prem Vrat's the issues that he has raised in. Unless otherwise there is a transparency and accountability for any public fund that is utilized, we don't find right kind of results. So unfortunately, that is missing, and we need to design such a regulatory mechanism. In the NEP also they have mentioned that we should have a regulatory mechanism, but light but tight. They have mentioned like that. So it should not make the people feel that somebody is riding on us. And at the same time, they should not enjoy absolute freedom of utilizing the money, whatever they have. So that is the kind of regulation required. And we should definitely assess the institutions on a set performance indicators to check whether the investment that is made by the government and the society or the public, whatever it may be, is properly translated into the results and outcomes. So that kind of mechanism is also need to be evolved. Right kind of mechanism. We have some mechanisms which are not seriously working. That is why still so many gaps are present in the education system. And one important point, say, Premraj sir has mentioned, is the industry institutional linkage and making industry participative in educational institution promotions and development, not only as corporate social responsibility, as the major stakeholders. Say whatever the kind of outcome that we are generating, they are the first beneficiaries. So they have to look at the system and they have to liberally fund and finance. And I think government also can bring out a policy that every corporate sector has to spend this much percentage or allocate this much percentage of their turnover to the education sector, because they are the stakeholders. They are taking the benefit of educational institutions.
Yes, true.
So in that way, we can allow the flow of money. And surprisingly, you can see that the people of India have realized the importance of education. And even at the lowest of the lowest income people, they are ready to save and spend on education, children education. So that is a wonderful change that we could see in the country. But what is important is the government has to protect their interests and see that whatever that they are paying is reasonable and rightly utilized. And there we could see some gap that some private institutions are exploiting this, and they are delivering quality product, but they are charging more than what is reasonable.
Yeah, true.
So in that way also, there is some amount of check is necessary. So overall, the situation is we have a system which is supporting the institutions, if not adequately, but to some extent, and we have to definitely scale up, as mentioned rightly and reported in NEP, that we have to increase the spending on education from 1.6% of the GDP to the 6%. So it's a huge rise, and that requires definitely a different model of funding and financing to the institutions. I am sure that definitely the government, people in the government will work out and make it out. Thank you very much.
Very wonderful. Very wonderful, sir. Let me quickly summarize. I think the takeaways of 1 hour of discussion, the first one and the most important one I would say is what Professor Prem gave us, the formula of funding, faculty, and freedom. There is a fourth one which I'm missing somewhere.
Flexibility.
Flexibility. I thought flexibility, freedom
No, flexibility and
flexibility is autonomy and and flexibility. I think that's what you mean by that. I think this is a fantastic this thing. Once funding comes, the other three will follow, provided there is a political will. The society itself has to start looking differently towards the education. Professor Prem made a very important point that education is not an expenditure; it's an investment in the future generation, and that's what, in fact, most of our parents do. They are willing to, sacrifice their present so that the future for their children becomes important. It's surprising that as a nation, as a society, as a this thing, we are not in a position to do that. Professor Prem, in fact, hinted that the amount of money we give to our temples, if that could be in some form diverted towards education, that would ease the burden of our educational expenditure like nobody's business. We did talk about the online and if it can reduce the expenditure, reduce the cost of education, and can it be used to scale it up in such a fashion that today we have a GER ratio which we are saying we will increase it to 50% by 2030, 2035. It's the goalposts keep shifting, but that activity means we have many more youngsters to be educated, especially in the higher education, than we are able to do today. Professor Rama made a correct point that what we are doing today is inefficient. The quality is questionable, and we have not yet established a mechanism of ensuring quality, the feedback mechanism of ensuring quality at a national level. We are also talking of Industry 4.0 and the changes that are going to come our way. The jobs which we don't know will be existing in future, and the skill sets and the knowledge required for that, but we are still doggedly going ahead with our models of the private public sector academic institutions, and continuing to make sure that our students are in a position to recognize those challenges, take on those challenges, and build extra skill sets required to face those challenges in future. It's been a very wonderful session, sir. Professor Premwar, Professor Rama, my personal, thanks to you. It's been a privilege, sir, listening to both of you speak. Please accept my very personal gratitude that I could be part of this institution, and you allowed me to moderate and interrupt. I wouldn't have liked. No professor likes to be interrupted while speaking, but then we had a time domain. Mr. Arora, it's been a wonderful session. I'm very sorry we could not have Mr. Harsh back, but he made some fantastic points, especially in terms of EdTech and the funding financing. He gave us different routes through which funding can come to academic institutions. I think I'm thankful to him for. It's a pity he couldn't come join back and add more to the discussions. Mr. Gopi Arora, thanks to you, we had a 1 hour of wonderful discussions. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Shrihari Prakash Honwad. for moderating this session so well. I must thank all the panelists here who joined us today for the session. Professor K. Rama Mohan Rao, Vice Chairman, AP State Council of Higher Education. Professor Prem, Chairman, Board of Governance, IIT Dhanbad and IIT Mandi. Pro-Chancellor, Professor of Eminence and Chief Mentor, the NorthCap University. Of course, Dr. Shrihari for moderating this session. Harsh Shah, CEO, India affiliate of the Institute of Risk Management, for joining us for this session. It was pleasure to host all of you at this 3-day APAC Higher EdTech Innovation Conclave. Let me give you a small brief about these 3 days. In these 3 days, we hosted more than 75 education thought leaders who dwelled upon various issues like adaptation of newest technologies like blockchain and AI, industry connect, entrepreneurship, national education policy, digitization of higher education institutions, new age skills, industry 4.0, blended and hybrid learning, funding for education institutions. It was exactly to the day a year ago when educational institutions across the country sent students back home and discussing about the changes that education system had to undergo could not have come at a better time. We at APAC News Network believe that we are doing our little bit. The 3-day Higher EdTech Innovation Conclave has been a huge, huge success. Thanks to all panelists, partners, delegates for joining us. It is now a foregone conclusion that blended learning, or you must say a hybrid learning, is going to be the way forward in the new world order. Thank you again for joining us for this session. I must thank all of you for joining with us on this 3-day APAC Higher EdTech Innovation Conclave. We take a break here. Thank you so much. We end this discussion here. Thank you so very much for joining us today. Thank you.